Welcome, everybody. I'm Gretchen Hochmeister, the director of the Hotchkiss Library, and we're so pleased to have you here. We had been looking forward to having our first in-person event outside on the lawn at the library this evening, but given the weather forecast and the darkening skies, we decided this was a safer alternative. So it's nice to have Zoom as a backup now for us when we have these weather situations. So please keep your mics muted during our presentation. Barry will be speaking with Brian, and when they conclude their conversation, we will be able to pose questions. You can either use the raise hand function to pose your question and we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself at that point, or you can type a question in the chat and direct it to me at any time during the event, and I will then read those questions to Brian and Barry. So we are thrilled to have you here this evening, and let me just take that down, and we are going to spotlight our guests, and I will introduce them. We are thrilled to have Barry Meier here with us this evening. Barry is a former New York Times reporter, and he was part of the Times team that won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. He is a two-time winner of the George Polk Award for Investigative Reporting, and he is the author of, I believe, 3 books. Is that right, Barry?
Correct.
3, including the best-selling Painkiller, an Empire of Deceit and the Origin of America's Opioid Epidemic, which was originally published in 2003, and I believe a second edition was released in 2018. He has just published Spooked, The Trump Dossier, Black Cube, and the Rise of Private Spies, which he will be discussing with our very own Brian Ross, who's a member of our board of directors at the library and investigative journalist for the Law and Crime Network. So welcome, Barry and Brian.
And Gretchen, thank you very much. Let me again thank you and Holly Nelson for the programs you have put together during the pandemic to keep this our light shining and our beacon here of literacy and intelligence and thoughtful ideas. And we're very pleased to have Barry Meier join us. He's an old friend and colleague. We've worked together for almost 2 decades on a variety of stories. And I'm quite pleased to have him here with his new book, Spooked. And it's a fantastic read. And I might say that his reporting included some of the work that I did at ABC News, along with my colleague Rhonda Schwartz, and we're quoted in the book. And I know a lot about this, and I thought Barry provided new details I'd never heard before. And Barry, thank you so much for being here. When you say private intelligence,
Thanks, Brian. You froze a little bit at the end there, but based on what I could hear, first of all, let me just start out by thanking everyone here at Hotchkiss for having me down. Gretchen, Holly, and yourself. It's a fantastic library. So I've driven past it for years. And so anyone who comes through Sharon, it's definitely worthwhile just to stop in and see the wonderful architecture. So the subtitle of the book, Private Spies, what do I mean by that? Essentially, when we think of spies, we typically think of, the FBI, the CIA, the Mossad, MI6, government spying agencies. But in recent decades, there's been an explosion of what is called a private intelligence industry. It's essentially operatives that will hire themselves out to companies, to law firms, to Hollywood, to the wealthy, to the controversial. And I've taken a bit of liberty in calling them private spies. If you asked most of these folks, they would say, no, we don't spy, we're intelligence gatherers. We deliver people high quality information that will help guide their actions, guide their litigation strategies. But in fact, when one digs down a little bit below the surface, they may not spy themselves, but they utilize the services of people who do spy. They may not hack themselves, but lo and behold, they often come into possession of material that's been hacked from people's computers or cell phones. So yes, the definition of spy in the subtitle of the book is quite broad, but in many cases, it's applicable to the people that I'm writing about.
And Barry, you talk about these private spies working for Hollywood big shots like Harvey Weinstein and oligarchs. But a big focus are the people who went to work to create what came to be known as the Trump Dossier. And I think what's so interesting here is the connection between these private spies and their ability often to plant stories in the media that benefit their clients. So take us through what happened with the Trump dossier and the group known as Fusion GPS.
Well, I'd be happy to, and let me just put that into context as well. So political opposition, or oppo, as it's known, is kind of as old as the hills, right? Every time you have a political race, you have one side trying to dig up dirt on the other. And for, in the past, it was basically, campaign staffers that would go through old newspaper clippings and they find, Brian Ross, wasn't he like, have like a history of drunk driving? Let's like drop that bomb on him and muddy him up a little bit. Back in the, when Bill Clinton was running for president, there you had the emergence really for the first time of private investigators being hired to do the dirt digging. As you may recall, there were a lot of allegations that Bill Clinton was involved with extramarital affairs. There were the so-called bimbo eruptions, and his campaign hired a private investigative firm out in San Francisco to basically dig up dirt on these women and try to intimidate them into silence. So this starts kind of revving up the involvement of private spies, private investigators in politics. And in 2016, with the Trump campaign, it takes a giant leap forward. You have a firm called Fusion GPS, as you mentioned, which was formed by two former Wall Street Journal reporters, Peter Fritsch and Glenn Simpson. And what they do is they sort of sell their services, and they are hired first by through a Republican front organization to try to derail Trump during the primary. When that doesn't work, they then go shop their services to to a law firm that's working for Hillary Clinton's campaign. And it is in that process that they hire Christopher Steele, a former MI6 agent who once served in Moscow, to gather dirt about Trump in Russia. And what makes this situation so interesting and so compelling to me as a journalist and as a writer is I kind of tell the story of Glenn Simpson. He's a principal character in the book, and when you first meet him in the book, he's still at the Wall Street Journal, and he's getting a lot of stories from these private intelligence agencies. They're feeding him tips. He's converting them into stories to the newspaper, and he kind of adopted that model as his business model when he started Fusion GPS. He called it journalism for rent. And he basically would go to clients and say, I've got all of these great relationships with journalists. I know people at the New York Times, I know people at the Wall Street Journal, I know people at all the networks, so on and so forth. And they were basically hiring him because of his access to these media outlets. And because people in media outlets trusted him. We'll get to that part of the story later. But when it came to the 2006 campaign, he basically went to the Democratic National Committee and said, I can get this oppo right into the hands of the media. So basically, he kind of recreated the model where traditionally this oppo was gathered by private intelligence firms. It was given to like PR firms or political operatives. They would then feed it to the media. Glenn kind of said, you know what, I can mainline this myself. And that was sort of the fascinating evolution that I try to portray in the book.
Exactly. And of course, in campaigns, they were always worried about the October surprise. What's the event that would happen in the last few weeks of the campaign? There'd be no time to respond. We certainly saw during George W. Bush, there was a drunk driving record that came out, other things like that. In this case, Fusion GPS tried their darndest to plant the story before the election. And I know as a reporter then at ABC News, they approached us with this so-called dossier, these uncorroborated allegations about Donald Trump that were in many cases quite salacious. Nobody bit, but they kept pushing. So let's start with, how did they find out the so-called allegations that there was a tape, the so-called P tape of Trump in Moscow? There was a meeting supposedly of Michael Cohen, his lawyer, with Russian agents in Prague, the Czech Republic. Did that check out? Was there anything to all of that?
It's fascinating, Brian, because as you know, you were involved in some of the reporting on this, and part of the book chronicles how you sent stringers out in Moscow and elsewhere to try to confirm the allegations in the dossier, and they basically didn't pan out. And I think you're quoted in the book saying something to Glenn like, this isn't working, and he kind of ignores you and is charging full speed ahead. So, why did people get attracted to this? Why did they bite on this at all, or even believe that it had substance to it? Well, there was lots of evidence that the Russians did plan to meddle in the 2016 campaign. That wasn't a surprise. That was there. Government officials were warning about it. There was a hack of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, in June of 2016. So there was an atmosphere that certainly pointed to Russian interference in that election. So Glenn Simpson, the former Journal reporter, now operative, invites a group of reporters to a hotel in Washington, this very cute little hotel called the Tavern Inn. And at that hotel, they are introduced for the first time to Christopher Steele, the former MI6 agent. Now, I have seen lots of photographs of Christopher Steele. I've actually met Christopher Steele. When I met him, he didn't look like he did in his photographs. He was actually he was in his underwear, and he had a very bad case of bedhead, because I went to see him in his home. He wouldn't respond to my messages. And so I figured, well, I'm old, but I can still go knock on somebody's door. So I went to England and went to his doorstep. When he met other people, he looked quite differently. He had lovely coiffed hair. He wore expensive suits. He looked and acted the part of what he had been through much of his life, which was an agent for the British intelligence service. Well-spoken, well played. And when reporters sat down with him, naturally, they're going to think, oh my God, here's a guy, he's the real deal, and he is sharing something with me that is so mind-boggling. If it's true, that's the end of Donald Trump. So people scrambled around before the election to try to figure out whether any of this was true. They couldn't really confirm any of it. The dossier might have died a natural death at that point, but lo and behold, after the election, in 2017, January, BuzzFeed, a news website, decides simply to posts the dossier on its website, and kind of all hell breaks loose at that point. It is now out there. Everyone is scrambling after it. It becomes the, the source of tens of thousands of newspaper articles, television shows, blog posts, Twitter statements, so on and so forth. And even major newspapers like my former employer, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC News, all the cable channels are now in a foot race to give this document oxygen and to suggest in some way, shape, or form, in many cases, that the allegations in the dossier are true. I mean, one of the things that when I went back and started looking at the coverage, and obviously I had the benefit of hindsight in doing this, is, one of the formulations that was often used in speaking about the dossier was, well, it hasn't been disproven yet. And that's, constantly they would say, well, there's a rumor there's a P-tape, and that hasn't been disproven yet. And, it's sort of, as someone who spent their life in journalism, this is kind of anathema to how we really operate and should operate as journalists. And, part of the reason for writing the book, and part of what I hope people come away from the book with, is an understanding of how, in this rather turbulent period of Donald Trump and media expansion and media polarization from a political standpoint, lots of reporters and news organizations fell prey, sort of kind of set their general standards aside and kind of fell prey to these kinds of constructions.
And here you had sort of this real life James Bond with Christopher Steele. How good was this information? Here he had served in Moscow. The assumption was, this is a guy that really knows what's going on. We've got to believe him. Of his specific information that he posted in these raw intelligence reports, how much was true? How much was proven to be not true?
Actually, I think very little of it is true.
Very little.
Very little. I mean, some of the most salacious allegations, which gained a tremendous amount of coverage, being in newspapers or airtime, were proven not to be true. The general overall theme, or the general overall statement in the dossier, that Russians were trying to interfere in the 2016 election, there's no question that that's true. There's also no question that that wasn't unique to the Steele dossier. That had been raised before. If all the Steele dossier said was, we're concerned that the Russians are going to interfere in the 2016 campaign, people would have yawned, people would have walked away. What set this document apart were these salacious claims, were the claims of collusion, were the claims of there's like bad stuff going on between members of, Donald Trump's campaign, inner circle, and holy cow, and that's the stuff that gave the dossier life and gave it juice. And by and large, most of those claims have either not proven to be true, that is to say, there's no evidence that they're true, or there's evidence that they are false. So it's very funny. Someone asked a spokesperson for Christopher Steele's intelligence firm, like, how did they respond to my book? And they put out some, corporate statement saying, well, Barry's book is filled with, errors and subjective statements and leaps of faith and blah, blah, blah. And I thought to myself, wow, I would be very happy to like have a face-off between the accuracy of my book and the accuracy of the dossier. I would welcome that. If Christopher, if you're listening for any reason, let's do it.
So Barry, bottom line, is it fair to say Donald Trump got a raw deal?
Oh, I'm not willing to say that. What I'm willing to say, because Donald Trump was as good as giving raw deals as getting raw deals.
Right.
So he doesn't get any sympathy from me in the book. In fact, you know, if Donald Trump wasn't who Donald Trump is, people wouldn't have believed all the things that they
Right.
believed about Donald Trump. I mean, he was sort of like, you know, a terrible person in many ways. So it's not hard to kind of go there with him. And my concern, my motivation for writing the book was not, oh, well, I'm gonna like say what a great guy Donald Trump is. It's very clear. I think my feelings about him are very clear in the book. It was my concern about our profession and my concern that our profession was damaged by this. There were people who, you know, Donald Trump used this as a cudgel against the media, you know, the Russia hoax, the enemy of the people. It's not to say that he would not have done so absent the dossier. You know, he's quite capable of taking anything and using it as a weapon. But I think the credibility of the media was damaged. I think the journalistic firepower that could have been directed at the real problems that existed within the Trump administration and the real wrongdoing that was going on were diverted into what essentially was a sideshow. And it may have been a colorful sideshow. It may have had a P-tape, and it may have had Michael Cohen meeting supposedly with Russian operatives in Prague, and all the bells and whistles of like a great spy novel. But it diverted reporters from doing their job.
The Fusion GPS people say that there's nothing sinister about what they do, and that you should know better than anyone the truth, that all too often Barry Meier and his colleagues at the New York Times were calling us before we called them. That's what they say, that your colleagues and others, and me too probably, have relied on their information over the years for good stories.
Well, I am not going to comment on what my colleagues at the New York Times did, other than to say that I'm sure they were in contact with Fusion GPS. I say in the book that I was in contact with them on occasion, but I can say unequivocally that I never wrote a story based on information that they tried to shop to me. In fact, a lot of this, they tried to shop me a story and a colleague about a story about a guy named Sergey Millian, who, Brian, I think you know. And Sergey Millian was kind of a bit actor in this Trump, conspiracy theory. He was basically a real estate developer who claimed he had an in with the Trump organization, was a big wheel with the Trump organization. And that turned out actually not to really be true. And Glenn Simpson of Fusion GPS was convinced that he was some sort of a Russian spy, and was telling everyone to whom he was giving the dossier that, Sergey Millian was like the source of the P-tape and other critical information in the dossier. That proved out to be false. And people at the Wall Street Journal and at the Washington Post and elsewhere who wrote about that essentially got burned, because they were being fed false information.
We want to make sure that our people, our friends at the library, you can forward your questions, raise your hands. Gretchen's there to take them. We'll give them to Barry. We got lots of time for lots of good questions. The sort of conservative on the right news media has expressed surprise that you, as a former New York Times reporter, would actually tell this story, which in a sense casts some doubt on the credibility of your former paper and other major news outlets.
Well, I can't predict how people are going to react to my work. It was never, first and foremost in my mind to think, well, who's this book going to appeal to? Every book that I've written because I thought it was important. When my first book, Painkiller, came out, which was the first book that was actually ever written about the OxyContin crisis and the Sackler family and the illegal marketing of OxyContin by its manufacturer, I didn't think, who's going to like this? And in fact, that book was totally ignored. So, I've accepted the fact that as an author, you don't control what happens to your work once it goes out into the world. And you don't control who appropriates your work when it goes out into the world. All I can hope for, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have it here, is to have forums where the book can be spoken, talked about, where I can express my views about it, where people can ask questions about it, and where there can be a back and forth and hopefully a useful conversation about it.
Have you heard much from your colleagues, former colleagues at the Times or other newspapers? And, I think reporters make mistakes. They get burned by sources.
Right.
The right thing to do is immediately correct it. Have people done that who got burned essentially on the dossier?
Well, first of all, as far as the Times go, the Times ran a very extensive excerpt from the book 2 weeks ago, which got a lot of pickup and coverage. So if they were queasy about carrying a piece of the book, and that part of the book really dealt with the relationship between journalists and private operatives and focused largely on the case of Fusion and the dossier, they wouldn't have done that. I mean, New York Magazine ran a lengthy excerpt as well. So I think it's fair to say that the mainstream media has paid attention to the book as well. I had a conversation in another library about 2 weeks ago with Mike Isikoff, who is a reporter with Yahoo News and is one of the people who actually wrote extensively and quite favorably about the dossier immediately before and after the 2016 election. And Mike sort of realized that there was a significant problem with the dossier, and to his credit, sort of disavowed his previous reporting, was very forthright about what had happened, and basically said that all of us should have scrutinized this much more closely. And he's right. Unfortunately, he's also in a minority. We journalists, and Brian, I don't know if you share this sentiment with me, we're very thin-skinned creatures, and we don't take to criticism very well. I mean, we're very good at ladling it out, but when it's turned around and someone scrutinizes us with the same type of scrutiny we use to look at other people or institutions, journalists tend to get very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and you cite several examples of that in the book, and you're certainly right about that. But journalists need to, it's a humbling experience, but when you made a mistake and you get nailed for it, you have to take it and understand that's the nature of the beast. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. Gretchen, what do we have as questions?
All right, our first question is, do you think this private spying represents a permanent change in political modus operandi?
I definitely do, because you know, the political oppo work or the involvement of private investigators in political oppo was basically a seasonal pursuit. You know, it basically started at the beginning of an election and ended when an election was over. But fusion, as I kind of write about in the book, sort of turned it into a forever business. So right after the 2016 campaign had ended and Donald Trump was elected, they get together and they form kind of a nonprofit black money organization. And by black money, I mean dark money. I mean money where the donors are not identified. And they bring in their first year of operation, $7 million. That is 7 times as much as they were paid by the Democratic National Committee when they were working for Hillary Clinton's campaign. And that $7 million is then funneled to Fusion GPS and to a company associated with Christopher Steele, the British former spy, among others. So they took what was essentially a one-time operation and turned it into this massive money operation.
I think that's one of the most remarkable things of all the remarkable things in the book, that this kept going even after the election, even after essentially the key elements, the most salacious elements, were shown not to be the case.
Yes, and it's continued on, as far as I know, to today. You know, this first group that they formed, which was called the Democracy Integrity Project, morphed into another group called Advanced Democracy. And I don't know whether advanced democracy still exists. These tax filings tend to lag events, but it may have morphed into something else, as you know, right now, for all I know.
Gretchen, is there another question there?
Not in the chat, but I have a question. I was wondering how this industry of private spying has impacted the work of traditional intelligence agencies. Have they had to work differently now? Or
Well,
is
there's
their
actually
work more difficult?
there's actually a lot of coordination, and it's sort of, that is a kind of scary part of the story as well. You would think, and Gretchen, your question pre-proposes that, you know, government spying and private spying operate in separate lanes. That is not the case at all. They swap information. Private spies will report back to government intelligence agencies. They will be commissioned by governments to do jobs so that it has a veneer of being done by a organization outside of government. I mean, we know that Black Cube, for example, did work for the Israeli government, right? They were given assignments by the Israeli government. I also know from a previous book that I wrote about a gentleman that Brian knows, Robert Levinson, who was a former FBI agent turned private investigator who disappeared in Iran while he was working as a consultant for the CIA. All the reports that he was gathering for his private clients were being sent back to the CIA, to his handler there. Similarly, Christopher Steele worked for private clients through his firm in Britain. He was sending lots of reports that he was preparing for private clients to people at the United States State Department. So it's not just, there's like informational reasons for doing it, but it's also kind of trying to grease the wheels and generate business at the same time.
I think one thing that we sort of gloss over is important. Christopher Steele had these great sources in Moscow with all sorts of information coming in, or not?
Well, funny you should bring that up. At the end of the day, it turned out that while Christopher Steele's reports looked like the kind of things that you would pull out of the files of MI6, and they would talk about source A and source B, and it was all like, coded with spy world language, the actual person that was gathering this information in Moscow for him was this kind of junior analyst who had no training as a spy, had never worked for a government spying agency, and who was basically going over to Moscow and having drinks with his high school buddies. He lived here in the United States. His name was Igor Danchenko, and I'm sure he's a perfectly lovely man. But, I keep thinking, have this image of, these meetings that, people from the Times and the Wall Street Journal and ABC News, or the Washington Post, I should say, had with Christopher Steele, and they're seeing this guy who's looking really chuff and looks like the real deal. But what they're really looking at is like one of those Russian nesting dolls, where like you pulled off the part of it that was Christopher Steele.
Matryoshka dolls.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you went down a couple of layers, and then you would like pull out this little guy, Igor Danchenko. And I have this thought that, if Igor Danchenko had been brought by Fusion GPS or Christopher Steele to these meetings with journalists in Washington and they said, here's the guy who's really bringing all this information to us, all those journalists would have walked out of the room. And it also turns out that in early 2017, while everyone was writing about the dossier, when all these allegations were flying around, the FBI tracked down Igor Danchenko and they interviewed him. And we didn't know about what he said in that interview until last year, when the notes, extensive notes of that interview were released. But when they were, we found out that in 2017, Igor Danchenko, when he was questioned by the FBI, essentially said, I don't know if any of this is true. And, it looks like the Christopher Steele is kind of like taken what I told him and ran with him, kind of like overstated what I was telling him. So even Igor Danchenko didn't know whether this is true or not.
So he was suggesting that Steele had embellished what he said.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, given all of that, are there legal consequences for Christopher Steele or the Fusion GPS people?
Well, Christopher Steele has been sued twice in England by individuals that were named in the dossier. He prevailed in one of those suits. He had to pay minimal damages in another suit. There is currently a major lawsuit underway here in the United States against Fusion GPS by the founders of a major Russian institution called Alpha Bank. And they are suing Fusion GPS and Glenn Simpson for libel for statements that were made in the dossier about them. So that litigation has been going on for about a year or so, and it's kind of tangled up in the types of pretrial maneuvering that takes place in these cases. We don't know what's going to result from it, but it is quite possible that if the discovery requests that are being made by the Alpha Bank founders succeed, we're going to learn a lot more about what Fusion GPS did, how it chopped this information, and what it knew.
Barry, for an investigative reporter to go into this world of mirrors, what is that like? What's the degree of difficulty? And why did you decide to take on this topic in the first place?
Well, I'm a stubborn person, I think, probably is probably the first prerogative, first hurdle I had to get over. In some ways, I analogize it to the reporting or the thought process I went through when I first started reporting about the drug OxyContin. Its manufacturer for Purdue Pharma was making all kinds of claims for the drugs. It was citing these studies as scientific support for its claims. And these studies and the claims were being kind of repeated and repeated in the media. And I decided, well, this is all really interesting, but what did these studies really say? What are these studies? And so I went down to Washington. I went into these like medical archives. I found these studies. And I realized when I looked at them that not only did they not support what Purdue Pharma was claiming for them, they in some cases contradicted the safety of this drug. And it's kind of the same mindset, I think, that I used when I approached this story, which is to say, people were making claims, people were making assumptions, people were repeating things. So let's kind of take a forensic approach to this and examine the basis for these claims and whether in fact there is a foundation for them.
How tough was it to write the book?
Well, the book was more tough to write from a structural standpoint than from a reporting standpoint. In all my two previous books, kind of basically they start out, they follow a story. They had a very natural narrative arc to them. So there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. There wasn't a single story that was strong enough to sustain that here. So what I had to do was weave together 3 or 4 different stories and create the narrative arc of the book that way. And so from the standpoint of writing, that was more complex and required a bit of I won't say literary trickery, but literary juice that I hadn't had to use in my earlier books.
Barry, as a former New York Times reporter, a seasoned investigative journalist, what do you rely on every day when you get up to find out what's going on? What do you read? Who do you listen to? How do you get your information, and how do you sort it out?
Well, first I rely on my wife. I mean, that's the basic rule of thumb. I tend to look at, because I've been spending many months up in the country, websites, so I look at the New York Times, I look at the Washington Post, and I also look at the Wall Street Journal. And I find that, surveying those, I get a generally good sense of what's going on. I've kind of gotten away from watching cable news because I've just found it too politically charged in the last year or two. I mean, it's all being driven politically, regardless of where it falls on the political spectrum. I find sometimes when I go on, I look at Twitter sometimes, not to get drawn into the craziness that's on there, but sometimes I find references or links to articles that are informative and that I want to read. It's sort of like, I guess one of the you know, one of the things we have to do is choose where our information is coming from. But also, even when we're doing that, I think it's important to think about, I mean, at least the process of doing this book made me think about, why is this story here? Why suddenly am I reading about this? And does someone have an agenda here? Did someone plant this story? And am I being told about it? Told that by the news organization? And I'm not saying that one has to be paranoid and think about this all the time, but I think the process of doing this book made me realize that it's not infrequent that stories appear because someone with a vested interest, and in many cases a financial interest, in seeing something get publicized, has a role in making sure it is publicized.
And as you know, Barry, oftentimes people like Glenn Simpson and others who provide information will insist that there could be no fingerprints. Nobody can know where you got this. It has to be on your own. And when reporters agree to that, they're robbing their readers, their viewers, of a kind of transparency to know, where's this coming from? What is the agenda?
That's one of the practices that I hope at some point in the relatively near future, news organizations will stop. I don't, you know, I have dealt with whistleblowers throughout my career. They're often problematic. They bring agendas, they bring personal grievances, whatever, to the table. But there are individuals who really are putting themselves on the line, their careers, their safety, what have you, to get information out. That is not the case with people like Fusion GPS, other firms like them. They're basically getting paid to do this. They're getting paid to deliver this information. And I don't see any reason why their role in a story, why they should get the same sort of protection and anonymity as a whistleblower. I have a good friend who is a private investigator, and he and I talked about this. And he said to me, well, hey, Barry, you know, some reporters might be willing to do that, but, you know, their editors are going to kill them. Editors, you know, editors are never going to let that happen. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, but I find it really troubling. And I find it, you know, like there's, you know this, Brian, I know this, that there is like a lot of stuff that goes behind the curtains of journalism that readers never find out about, or the viewers never find out about.
We've got about 5 minutes left for any more questions. And let me ask you this.
Yeah.
What do you make of a
questions?
Go ahead, Gretchen. Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There are a few questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Raise hands. Kevin, would you like to pose your question? We can't hear you, Kevin.
Gretchen, do you want to tell me what Kevin's question was? And then
He just has his hand raised. I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
But let's see.
Unmute.
Yeah, he was unmuted. There we go. Let's see. We still can't hear you. Would you like to send it in the chat box, Kevin? In the meantime, Dennis has a question.
Hey, Barry, congratulations on the book. I think it makes a real contribution. Just one note, I don't know if you've seen it, but Matt Taibbi posted a note very recently. He's written a lot about this, and he focuses on your interaction with Isikoff, and Isikoff sort of chiding you for appearing on Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that.
Yes, yes,
You
yes.
might take a look at it. He's quite favorable to you. But my question really, you focus a lot on the media and their credulity in this whole episode. But I wonder how much of that was fed in part by the government itself. I mean, our government, which never, which seem themselves to take this at some level seriously. I don't know about the P-tape, but certainly the collusion issue. And they focus on, Carter Page is the most improbable, behind the scenes mastermind. And yet they chased him with 3 FISA applications. I mean, how do you rate them, their performance?
The government's performance?
Yes.
You know, for my previous book, Missing Man, which was about the story of Bob Levinson, the former FBI agent, I grew up, you know, like most people thinking, wow, the FBI is great, you know, like Joe Friday, you know, I was all in, all in on the FBI. And I came away from that book, you know, like kind of, you know, very skeptical about the initiative, the intellectual curiosity, the drive of most FBI agents. You know, I found that I was digging up stuff that they didn't have a clue about when they were supposed to be out finding this guy. And so when it came to 2016 campaign, you know, I tend to believe that there was a reason and a valid reason for the FBI to open up an investigation to determine whether people on the Trump campaign were colluding with the Russians. You know, they had that information from George Papadopoulos. There was a basis for it. However, as I think was pointed out in the report by the Inspector General of the Justice Department, there wasn't a basis for seeking the FISA warrant on Carter Page. And that, you know, they actually used material from Mike Isikoff's Yahoo News story about Carter Page to, as the material, part of the reason to justify the warrant. Mike, in that interview, and I've known Mike for many years, you know, he said, well, you know, the government was investigating this, so I had a reason to write about Carter Page. That's, you know, I don't know if that's a great reason, because, you know, governments, FBI, the FBI opens preliminary investigations all the time. And sometimes they open up those investigations at the urging of people who have an adversarial interest to the person who they want to see investigated. So, you know, journalists have to make a decision like, has this investigation reached a point where it is moved from the, you know, preliminary stage to the actual investigative stage, you know, where they're issuing subpoenas, where stuff is going on. And, you know, that, you know, that's one problem in deciding what to write about when the FBI is supposedly investigating something. You know, it's also clear from my reporting, or I certainly became convinced through my reporting, that part of the strategy of Fusion GPS to get the dossier into the public forum was to, you know, make sure it got into the hands of government officials. And once it got to the desk of James Comey, there is a person who is quoted in the book, a journalist quoted in the book, who is saying, I got a phone call from Glenn Simpson, who said to me, this is a game changer. The FBI is looking at it now. And thus that became part of the justification for writing about it. It's not like anything in the dossier had gotten better with the fact that it gotten to the FBI, but now journalists had this excuse or this reason or this justification to write about it.
We have time for the last two questions I have here from the audience, Brian.
You bet.
All right, Kevin typed his question for us and he said, Robert Mueller said that he was unfamiliar with Fusion GPS in testimony following the release of his Russia report. Was that credible? And if so, what does that imply about his report and his role in compiling the report?
What I recall more specifically, Kevin, from the Mueller report was that there was no mention or very little mention of Christopher Steele in the Mueller report. And there was, in fact, evidence that Mueller gathered that refuted one of the basic allegations in the Steele report, Steele dossier, which was this supposed trip that Michael Cohen took to Prague. You know, there are a lot of people that aren't satisfied with the Mueller report, and I get that, and I thought it was very unsatisfying in other ways, but they tended to have to do less with, you know, collusion, but the question of whether Donald Trump was, you know, interfering with the Mueller report and basically, you know, should have been charged with basically blocking the investigation.
And we have a question from Harding, and he's wondering if double agents are used in this sort of activity.
Well, it's funny because there's a story in the book about an individual, it was a real character, named Rob Moore, who went to work for a large corporate intelligence firm. And he was given the job of infiltrating, pretending that he was a documentary filmmaker, and infiltrating a group of activists who were campaigning to ban the use of asbestos in developing countries. You know, asbestos is a very deadly building material, and apparently the client of this investigative firm had a financial interest in the asbestos industry. So Rob Moore like does this. He's like incredibly successful. He fools everybody. He works for years and nobody tumbles to what he's doing. And finally, he has this moment where he thinks to himself, like, this is awful. I don't want to spend my life doing this. And he goes to another group and basically says, why don't you hire, you know, to like an advocacy group, and says to them, why don't you hire me and I'll work as a double agent and I'll tell you what this firm is up to. So there are a couple of cases, like a couple of instances in the book where, you know, it's just like, this is an industry that is just loaded with double crosses, double dealing, people flipping sides, ditching, you know, thank you very much. You used to be my client, but now you're my target.
And in fact, one of the more confusing aspects of Fusion GPS was that at the same time they were digging up dirt on Trump, they were also working for essentially elements of the Russian government or connections.
They're working for oligarchs.
president.
Yes, they were definitely working for oligarchs. So, you know, you can talk Russian interference, but you can also take Russian money. I guess those two things are not incompatible with each other.
Well, Barry Meyer, it's a fantastic book. It's a terrific read. It's written like a John le Carré spy novel. It's absolutely fascinating to go through it. And thank you so much for spending the evening with us here at the Sharon Hotchkiss Library. It's very much appreciated. And we look forward to
thank you,
the
Brian.
next book. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I greatly appreciate it. And thanks everyone else, everyone who took the time to call in.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Thanks for driving down, Barry. It was wonderful. And don't forget, everyone, we have copies of the book available. So you can email Holly or me or call us tomorrow at the library and we will set you up with one of these books. And we also have an event next Tuesday with a discussion with Peter Steiner on his new thriller. Peter lives in Sharon and he has a new detective novel, The Constant Man, which is coming out this week. So that's on Tuesday evening at 7. So thanks everyone and stay safe, and we hope to see you at the library soon. Bye-bye.